JavaScript interview questions. In this new series I'll be starting on my YouTube channel, I'll be sharing a couple of questions that can be asked in JavaScript interviews, and I'll be sharing the answers and including code examples where needed. Some of the questions that I share in this series will be based on research that I've made from other platforms or other interviews, and for some other questions I'll be creating them myself based on JavaScript topics and concepts that I feel could be asked in interviews. This video is the part 1, and in this video I'll be sharing 5 JavaScript questions that can be asked in interviews, and I'll be sharing the answers also. And if you enjoy this video when you get to the end, please share with others, like it, and also subscribe for more questions I will be addressing in this series. So let's get started. The first question we'll be starting with is, what is the difference between let, const, and var? And the answer is, let, const, and var are 3 keywords you can use to create variables in JavaScript. And the difference is that using var, variables can be reassigned, and also variables will be hosted to the top of the local or global scope with a default value of undefined. With let, variables can also be reassigned and will also be hosted, but they will not be hosted with a default value. So if you try to reference that variable before initialization, you're going to get a reference error. And with const, this works similarly with let. It hosts variables, but since they do not have a default value, if you try to reference it before initialization, you're going to get a reference error. But unlike var and let, variables declared with const cannot be reassigned. I have this simple example here just to show you how these different keywords work. So in this first one, F1, we have on line 6 here, we declare the variable num and we initialize a value of 8 to it. But before this declaration, we try to access the variable on line 4, and then we also reassign it here. So down here, when I call F1, if I run node test, you see we're not going to get any error. Even though we're trying to access the num variable before the line it was initialized, we don't get any error. Instead, we get the default value of num, which is undefined. So the num variable is hosted to the top of the local scope with a default value of undefined, but then when it gets to this line 6, then it is now assigned a value of 8. Now when we go to F2, I'm going to comment this one here and F2. In F2 here, we declare the variable num with let, and we try to access it at the top here. Yes, the num variable is also hosted to the top of the local scope, but look at what happens when I run node test. You see we have a reference error, cannot access num before initialization. So even though the variable num is hosted to the top of the local scope, it is not hosted with a default value, and that's why we get this reference error. So the only time you can access num when you use let is after this line where it has been initialized. And then to the last function, F3. In F3 here, we declare the variable num with const, and then we try to access that variable here. The num variable is hosted to the top, but because just like let, it is not hosted with a default value, we're also going to get this reference error. But another thing with const is that when you assign a variable with const, which is like constant, you cannot reassign that variable to a different value. You can see in this next line, I'm trying to assign it to a different value. So if I come here and I run F3, first we get the reference error, but if I comment this line and I run this file again, look how we get assignment to constant variable, which is a type error. So with const, you cannot reassign another value to that variable. Second JavaScript question, what does hoisting mean in JavaScript? Hoisting is a concept in JavaScript where the declaration of a variable, a function, or a class moves to the top of the scope that it is defined in, and this would be above the line it was actually written in the code. In the previous example, I already showed you a little of hoisting, but I'll be using a new example here. So I have this function print, which I declared on line 5, but you can see I'm trying to access this function on line 3. And what makes it possible for me to access this function on line 3 before the line it was actually written in the code is because of hoisting. So this function is hoisted to the top of the global scope, and then I can access it in line 3. Also, another hoisting that is happening here is inside the function. You can see I declare a num variable on line 8, but I'm also trying to access that num variable on line 6 and line 10. Now let's see what happens. If I run this file, you can see that the print function is called from line 3, even though it was declared here. That's due to hoisting. Also, when I try to console log num, you can see num at first is undefined. That's because the variable is hoisted to the top with a default value of undefined. And when I console log num here again, you can see it is now 10 because we have already passed the line of initialization. The third question, what are arrow functions and how are they different from normal functions? Arrow functions are a short and easier way of writing functions in JavaScript. The syntax involves an equal and a greater than sign to indicate an arrow. And this is what an arrow function looks like here. Here is the bracket for the accepted parameters of the function. Then we have the equal to sign and the greater than sign, which indicates an arrow. And then you have your block where you can run anything you want to run here in the function. So you can see here, if I run fn with hello and I, you can see it's console logs arg1 and arg1 here is hello, console logs arg2 here is hi, as you can see here. Now what is the difference between arrow functions and normal functions? Now there are a couple of differences, but I'm going to show you 3 of them. The first difference is that the arguments variable is automatically defined in a normal function, but it is not defined in an arrow function. You can see here we have print1, which is a normal function, print2, which is an arrow function. Here if I pass some argument, let's say 1 2 3, if I console log arguments here, watch what happens. You see we have the arguments variable and you can see the arguments that we pass to the function, but you can see here that it says argument is not defined. So in an arrow function, the arguments variable is not defined. Second difference is that normal functions create their own this variable, which points to the object that is calling the function, while arrow functions do not create their own this variables. So you can see here I have this object and this object has 2 methods. The first method print1 is normal function, while the second method print2 is created with an arrow function. Now in print1 and print2 I console log this and this. Let's check what print1 logs as this. If I run no test, you can see that the this in print1 points to this obj, and that's why we have this object that says print1 method and print2 method. But if I try to console log the this in print2, you can see this is an empty object. Usually it will even be the global document object if you are in a browser console, and the reason for that is because print2 does not have its own this. And the last difference is that arrow functions cannot be used as constructors, while normal functions can be used as constructors. The number 4 question, explain different methods you can use to select HTML elements from the DOM. In JavaScript, you have the document object, which is exposed from the browser API, and this object has different methods you can use to select HTML elements. Here are 5 of them. You have get element by ID, which is used to get an element by the value of its ID attribute. You have get elements by class name, which is used to get elements by the values of their class attributes. You have query selector, which is used to get an element that matches a CSS selector. You have get element by tag name, which is used to get elements by the tags used for them. And number 5, you have get element by name, which is used to get elements by the values of their name attributes. And the last JavaScript question in this video, what is the name for double equals and triple equals, and what are the differences between these operators? Double equals is known as a loose equality operator, while triple equals is known as a strict equality operator. Both operators are used for comparing values, but what are the differences? The double equals compares values by checking if the values are the same. The types of the values are not strictly checked, so 20 being a value with a string type and 20 being a value with a number type, when they are compared using this operator, you actually get true, because even if the types are different, the values are the same. Triple equals checks if the types of the values as well as the values themselves are equal. So if you are using 20 as a value of a string type and 20 as a value of a number type, if you compare them together using the strict equality operator, you would get false, because even though the values are the same, the types are different. I've explained the difference between these operators in a previous video, so I would leave a link to that video in the video description. That is it for part 1. These are 5 questions that I believe can come up in JavaScript interviews, and I'll also be leaving relevant links in the video description, relevant links that can make you understand each of these questions better. If you enjoyed this video, like I said at the beginning, please share with others, also like it and subscribe so that you can follow up with more questions I'll be sharing on my channel.